July 15th, 2026, and for the fifth consecutive morning, explosions are lighting up Iran's southern coastline before sunrise. This time, it's Greater Tunb Island, a scrap of land at the western mouth of the Strait of Hormuz that Iran has spent years turning into a forward staging ground for cruise missile storage and launch sites. American Central Command put out the confirmation within hours of the operation wrapping. Precision munitions went into coastal defense systems and missile facilities on that island in a 90-minute wave that started at 6 in the morning Eastern Time and ended at 7:30. No ambiguity in the wording. No hedging. Just a plain statement that the strikes further degraded Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the strait. But that strike on Greater Tunb Island is not even the headline anymore. Because less than 24 hours before those bombs went in, President Trump sat down for an interview with Fox News and said something that changes the entire shape of where this war is heading next. He told the country plainly that the strikes will keep coming, hard, every single night. And then he said the sentence that should stop anyone watching this conflict cold. Next week, it gets really bad for Iran because next week comes the power plants, next week comes the bridges. Read that again. This is not a threat aimed at missile bunkers or radar installations anymore. This is the President of the United States on live television, naming the national electrical grid and the physical infrastructure that holds Iranian cities together as the next phase of an already 5-day bombing campaign, and doing it as an ultimatum with a 1-week countdown attached. Let's back all the way up, because to understand how a war that supposedly ended with a ceasefire and a signed memorandum of understanding just last month ended up here, at the edge of a threat to knock out an entire country's power grid, you need to understand exactly how fast this thing has unraveled twice now. This war began on February 28th, when a joint American and Israeli strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with a chain of senior commanders sitting around him. It ran hot for weeks. By April, a ceasefire took hold. Then, in June, both governments signed a formal memorandum of understanding, a framework meant to actually end the fighting and open negotiations for good. For a few weeks, it looked like it might hold. And then, on July 7th, the Iranian side allegedly violated the terms of that memorandum by resuming attacks on commercial shipping near the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States responded by resuming what officials are now calling a full military campaign, with punishment strikes hitting more than 80 targets in a single opening night. President Trump formally notified Congress that combat operations had restarted, invoking his authority to keep American forces engaged in the fight for another 60 days without a vote. That is twice now that a negotiated peace between these two countries has collapsed inside of a matter of weeks. Twice. So here's where things stand today, in numbers that are not vague and not disputed by either side. This is night 5 of consecutive American strikes. More than 20 U.S. Navy warships and hundreds of military aircraft are currently operating across the Middle East. A naval blockade against Iranian ports has been back in effect since 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time on Tuesday. And within the first 17 hours of that blockade going up, American forces had already turned back 2 commercial vessels attempting to run it. And the justification for all of it was laid out by name, in public, by the man running this entire theater of war. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of United States Central Command, put out a statement that is worth sitting with because of how carefully it is worded. He said that over the past 7 days, Iran deliberately went after civilians across the region, striking 7 separate commercial ships in that window, leaving close to a dozen civilian crew members dead, missing, or wounded. He added that Iranian forces have also launched dozens of missiles and drones at neighboring Gulf countries in that same stretch of time. That is not a battlefield casualty count. That is a war crimes allegation, phrased in the careful, deliberate language of a legal case being built in real time. When a 4-star American admiral uses the word intentionally in an official statement about attacks on civilian mariners, he is not just describing what happened. He is constructing the justification, the one every Gulf partner, every shipping nation, and every international maritime body can point to and say, this is why the blockade is back. This is why the strikes continue. This is why whatever comes next is defensible under the framework everyone already agrees on. And that framework is exactly what gets invoked the moment the target list expands to something as consequential as a national power grid. The tanker attacks behind that statement are not abstractions either. A UAE-flagged supertanker and a sister vessel, the Mombasa and the Bahiyah, were hit by Iranian cruise missiles in Omani waters while running the internationally designated safe corridor through the strait. Between them, the 2 ships carried 46 crew members, 30 of them Indian nationals. 1 Indian crew member is dead. Multiple others across both vessels are wounded, 2 of them seriously. Days earlier, a Cyprus-flagged container ship called the GFS Galaxy was hit by an unidentified projectile off the coast of Oman, while its 24-member crew attempted to transit the strait, killing 1 more mariner, a 30-year-old marine engineer. Iran's own justification for that particular strike was that the vessel had taken what Tehran called an unauthorized route, despite what it says were prior warnings. Read that carefully, because that is the entire Iranian defense in miniature. A merchant ship, full of civilian mariners with no stake in this war, gets treated as a legitimate target because it sailed through water. Iran has unilaterally decided belongs to it, and international shipping lanes negotiated specifically to keep civilians safe get treated by Tehran as a suggestion rather than a boundary. So now let's talk about the platforms actually doing the work over the Persian Gulf this week, because the way this campaign is built tells you a great deal about how deliberately it is being run. Before a single bomb goes into a hardened target, the suppression of enemy air defense package goes in first. That is the job of aircraft purpose-built to hunt radar, flying ahead of the strike package, specifically to find every Iranian system that lights up to track them and force it to make a choice, go dark or get hit. Anti-radiation missiles carried on those aircraft home in on a radar signal the instant it activates, meaning the moment an Iranian system tries to do its job, it hands over its own coordinates. Electronic warfare aircraft ride alongside that package, jamming communications and radar picture on the Iranian side, so that whatever an IRGC command center is looking at during one of these strikes is closer to static than to a usable picture of what is actually happening overhead. Behind that suppression layer comes the strike package itself. Precision-guided munitions going into the hardened facilities identified ahead of time, cruise missile storage bunkers, launch sites, coastal defense systems, the kind of infrastructure that does not move and does not hide once it has been found. None of it happens without persistent surveillance, keeping eyes on the target list for days or weeks before a strike goes in, which is exactly why Iranian officials keep discovering, morning after morning, that whatever they had on a given stretch of coastline the night before, they no longer have by sunrise. This week, that layered approach expanded into a new category entirely. For the first time in this conflict, one-way attack drones were deployed in combat, launched from both aircraft and naval vessels, a cheaper and more expendable tool for grinding down coastal defenses and small craft without putting a single pilot at risk. CENTCOM has confirmed shooting down an Iranian cruise missile and a one-way attack drone of Iran's own in the same window, evidence that the exchange of fire in the Strait is no longer a one-directional bombing campaign, but an active, mutual engagement happening in both directions every single night. And here is where the honest accounting has to include what remains unverified, because this is exactly the kind of war where the gap between claim and confirmation matters as much as the strikes themselves. Iran's military has claimed strikes on American fighter jets at a base in Jordan, and claimed hits on a Fifth Fleet command facility in Bahrain. CENTCOM has confirmed 0 aircraft losses and 0 operational pauses. Iran's army separately claimed that 13 American missiles struck a garrison in Iran Shar, killing 7 of its own soldiers, a claim that, unlike Iran's claims about hitting American assets, came from Iranian sources describing damage to their own side rather than exaggerating damage to the other, which tends to carry more weight. That asymmetry, Iranian claims about hitting America running well ahead of anything CENTCOM will confirm, while Iranian admissions of their own losses tend to check out, tells you plainly which direction the propaganda is flowing and which direction the actual battlefield damage is flowing. Now here is the demand sitting at the center of all of this, and it deserves to be broken down piece by piece, because it is not a subtle one. Trump laid it out point by point in that Fox interview. Strikes continue tonight, hard. Strikes continue tomorrow night, hard. Strikes continue the night after that, hard. And then, if Tehran is not returned to the table by next week, the target list expands to energy infrastructure and to bridges, meaning the physical systems an entire civilian population depends on for electricity and for basic movement between cities. Trump was explicit that he is saving energy targets for last, his words, which tells you this escalation ladder was designed deliberately, not improvised in the moment. He also confirmed the United States had already struck Karg Island, Iran's most important oil export terminal, 3 separate times, while deliberately sparing its oil facilities specifically because of what a genuine disruption to Iranian oil exports would do to the global economy. He said the words himself, hit everything but the oil. Sit with that distinction for a second, because it tells you the entire logic of how this campaign is being calibrated. Iran's air defenses, its coastal missile batteries, its drone facilities, its cruise missile storage sites, all fair game, struck relentlessly for 5 straight nights. Iran's oil exports, deliberately protected because destabilizing global energy markets, is apparently a bigger strategic risk than continuing to grind down Iran's military infrastructure night after night. That is a war being fought with a very specific ceiling in mind, one where the United States wants Iran's military capability gone, but does not want the kind of global economic shock that would come from actually shutting off the oil. Iran's public response to all of this has been almost mechanically consistent throughout this entire conflict, and this week is no different. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Bagay said flatly that Iran has no plans to sit down for negotiations right now, and that its focus is on defense. In the same breath, Iranian officials insisted the country would continue honoring the Memorandum of Understanding as long as the other side did the same, which is a strange thing to say publicly, while your own cruise missiles are setting fire to tankers in a UN-negotiated safe corridor. The Revolutionary Guard, meanwhile, issued its own warning this week, threatening to shut down every other export corridor that it says benefits the United States, a threat aimed squarely at the same global oil markets Washington has been trying to keep insulated from this fight. That contradiction, claiming commitment to a ceasefire framework while actively working to violate its core purpose, is not a communication failure on Iran's part. It is the strategy. Iran's leverage in this war was never going to come from matching American air power target for target. It was always going to come from making the cost of this war expensive for everyone else, oil markets, shipping insurers, Gulf neighbors, global supply chains, in the hope that outside pressure eventually forces Washington to accept a deal on terms more favorable to Tehran than total capitulation. Every tanker hit, every threatened export corridor, every warning about further escalation is aimed less at the battlefield and more at the psychology of everyone watching oil prices from the outside. And this is not the first time this exact threat has been made either, which matters more than it might seem. Trump made almost identical threats against Iran's energy infrastructure earlier in this war, declaring back on April 7th what he called Plant Day, and then threatening the country's energy assets again on April 19th. Neither of those earlier deadlines resulted in the kind of infrastructure campaign being threatened now. That history could be read two ways, and both are worth sitting with rather than picking whichever one is more dramatic. It could mean this latest ultimatum is simply more of the same pressure rhetoric, a threat designed to force Iran back to the table without any real intention of following through, given how carefully Washington has otherwise tried to avoid rattling global oil markets. Or it could mean that after 2 ceasefires collapsing inside of months, after 7 civilian ships attacked in 7 days, after a formal accusation of intentional attacks on civilians now on the record from the CENTCOM commander himself, this is the moment the pattern actually breaks. And next week's deadline is the one that finally gets enforced. Nobody covering this conflict from the outside can say with confidence which of those two readings is correct, and that uncertainty itself is part of what makes the coming week so consequential. The reporter pressing Trump on all of this, Fox News chief foreign correspondent Trey Yingst, also asked directly whether achieving Washington's stated goals, keeping Iran from a nuclear weapon and reopening the Strait of Hormuz, could be done through air power alone or would ultimately require troops on the ground. Trump would not rule out a ground campaign, but he was careful about how he phrased it. Sometimes you need a ground campaign, he said, but we have other people that will do the ground campaign for us, an answer that keeps the option alive rhetorically while explicitly pointing toward regional partners rather than American boots doing that work directly. In the same interview, he raised the possibility of the United States actually seizing Karg Island outright, Iran's most important oil export terminal, saying that if Iran's capabilities are degraded far enough, he would do exactly that. Put those two statements next to each other and you get a fuller picture of where this campaign could be heading beyond next week's infrastructure deadline. A coastal strike campaign giving way to territorial seizure of the single most important node in Iran's entire oil export economy, still without American oil markets in Washington's crosshairs. Its actual oil facilities on the island are conspicuously being spared. Meanwhile, the diplomatic fallout from the tanker attacks is spreading well beyond Washington and Tehran. India's government confirmed that 30 of its nationals were aboard the 2 UAE-flagged tankers hit this week, with one confirmed dead and multiple others wounded, several seriously. New Delhi has formally registered its deepest concerns over the attacks through its foreign ministry. A diplomatic signal that Iran's targeting of commercial shipping is no longer a story contained to the Gulf states and Washington. It now directly touches a major world power with tens of thousands of its own citizens working as mariners on exactly the kind of vessels being struck. Jordan's air defenses intercepted 3 Iranian ballistic missiles that entered its airspace early this week, following an earlier intercept of 4 missiles days before that. Kuwait's armed forces confirmed they were actively engaging hostile drone attacks the same week, explicitly framing every explosion heard across the country as the result of its own air defenses intercepting incoming Iranian fire rather than the fire itself landing. Every one of those countries, none of them a direct party to the American strike campaign, is now absorbing regular Iranian retaliation simply for being geographically adjacent to a conflict they did not start and cannot control the pace of. Saudi Arabia, further south, has spent this same week trading fresh strikes with Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen after a fragile truce that had held for years began fraying, with the Houthis claiming Riyadh had bombed an airport under their control. Saudi officials have shown little appetite to be pulled back into that fight, having spent years trying to extract themselves from a war widely seen as unwinnable. But the timing of the Houthis testing that truce again, in the same week Iran is absorbing the heaviest bombing campaign of this entire conflict, is not likely to be a coincidence. A regional proxy network built by Tehran over decades does not need explicit orders from a supreme leader whose health is a subject of foreign speculation to start probing for openings the moment its patron comes under maximum pressure. So now, here are the 3 tracks running simultaneously against Iran this week, and none of them are moving in isolation. There is the military track, 5 consecutive nights of strikes, a coastal defense grid being dismantled island by island, cruise, missile storage facilities hit before Iran can relocate what survives. There is the financial track, a naval blockade choking off Iranian port traffic for the second time in 3 months, oil markets already reacting to every escalation this week the same way they reacted the last time this blockade went up. And there is the diplomatic and psychological track, a public accusation of intentional attacks on civilians, now on the record from the commander of the entire American military theater, an ultimatum with a hard 1-week deadline attached to it, and a foreign ministry spokesperson publicly refusing to negotiate while insisting his government still honors an agreement it is actively violating. Each of those tracks alone would put enormous pressure on any government. Running together, with a public 1-week countdown to striking the national power grid sitting on top of all 3, they compound into something considerably more dangerous than the sum of its parts. Because a government under that kind of simultaneous pressure from every direction has far fewer off-ramps than it would facing any single one of these threats on its own. So who is actually steering the American side of this campaign? And what does the chain of command actually look like right now? Because that matters just as much as what is happening inside Tehran. Admiral Brad Cooper is the operational commander running the day-to-day strike campaign out of Central Command, the man whose name is now attached to the formal public accusation of intentional attacks on civilians. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane sit above him in the chain, both name-checked directly by Trump this week in a public message crediting them, alongside Cooper, with what the president described as keeping the Strait of Hormuz open to everyone except Iran. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been working the diplomatic side in parallel, meeting with Jordan's foreign minister this week, specifically over regional security concerns tied to Iran's attacks on shipping and on neighboring countries. And sitting above all of them is a president who has now, on camera, floated the possibility of a ground campaign in Iran without ruling it out, while also saying he would prefer other nations handle that piece of it rather than American troops. On the Iranian side, the picture is genuinely harder to pin down, and that difficulty is itself part of the story. Iran's supreme leadership succession, following Khamenei's assassination in February, installed his son Mojtaba within days, but foreign reporting throughout the spring has raised real questions about his health and his visibility during major state functions. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and spokesperson Ismail Bagay have been the public diplomatic face-making statements this week, while the Revolutionary Guard's operational commanders continue running the maritime attacks and the missile strikes against Gulf neighbors independent of whatever diplomatic language Tehran's foreign ministry puts out on a given day. That is not a unified government prosecuting a coordinated strategy. That looks like several institutions moving on separate tracks, the diplomatic arm insisting on continued commitment to a ceasefire framework while the military arm actively works to undermine the very corridor that framework exists to protect. Now, before wrapping up the picture on Iran, it is worth pulling the lens out for a moment, because this is not the only maritime campaign reshaping a major waterway this week. Roughly 2,000 miles to the northwest, Ukraine has spent the past 9 days running a drone campaign of its own against Russian shipping in the Sea of Azov, an operation its own commander has nicknamed after the Ukrainian word for dairy products. Robert Brovdy, who goes by the call sign Madyar and commands Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, announced that his drone operators had struck 116 vessels in the Sea of Azov over that 9-day stretch, specifically targeting Russia's so-called shadow fleet, small flat-bottomed feeder tankers that move Russian oil from river terminals out into the Black Sea, where a single ocean-going tanker typically needs cargo from 12 to 15 of those smaller vessels just to fill up. Independent satellite imagery has already shown Russian vessel traffic in the Sea of Azov collapsing by more than half since the campaign began, with traffic near the Kerch Strait down by roughly 3/4. And on July 15th, marking Ukrainian Statehood Day, Brovdy announced the operation was expanding into the Black Sea itself, hitting 20 more vessels overnight, 17 oil tankers, 2 gas tankers, and a tugboat. He put it in exactly these words: "The first round of the naval battle is complete. Now the Black Sea, 2 entirely separate wars on 2 entirely separate coastlines, and the exact same underlying strategic logic running through both of them. When a conventional military cannot force a decisive result on land, choke the maritime economy instead, hit the tankers, hit the shipping, Make the war expensive for the country's ability to fund itself and to move anything by sea, and let that economic pressure do the work that missiles and infantry cannot finish on their own. So where does the honest assessment actually land on all of this? The version that does not simply repeat either government's press releases. Iran is losing this war by every measurable military metric that exists. A coastal defense network being dismantled island by island. A blockade back in effect for a second time in 3 months. A foreign minister publicly refusing to negotiate, while his own military violates the ceasefire framework he claims to still honor. What Iran has not lost is the ability to make this war painful for everyone standing near it. Tankers, oil markets, shipping insurers, mariners with no stake in this fight, who keep ending up dead or wounded because they happen to be transiting the wrong stretch of water on the wrong night. There is a quieter front in this war running through the Treasury Department that deserves its own mention, because it shows just how many directions Iran is being squeezed from at once. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced this week that his department is actively working to disrupt what he called Iran's illicit financial activities, specifically its use of digital assets to move money around sanctions. The Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned multiple cryptocurrency wallets tied directly to Iran's central bank, freezing more than $130 million in the process. That is not a headline strike, and it will not show up in any CENTCOM release, but it matters just as much as the bombs going into Greater Tunb Island, because it closes off one more avenue Tehran might have used to fund exactly the kind of missile and drone production this entire bombing campaign is trying to grind down. Oil markets have already priced in how seriously to take all of this. Crude climbed to its highest level in over a month this week purely on the reimposed blockade announcement, before Trump's later comments about Gulf state investment replacing any shipping toll took some of the edge off that spike. Every one of these tracks, the sanctions, the blockade, the nightly strikes, the diplomatic isolation spreading to India and the broader shipping world, is designed to compound, not to operate independently. And that is precisely why this week feels different from the earlier rounds of this same war. And that brings us to the actual structural risk sitting underneath this entire story, the one that should matter more than any single night's strike totals. A president has now put a public, one-week countdown on striking a national electrical grid and transportation infrastructure. Tools that, once broken, take years rather than nights to rebuild, and that inevitably touch civilian life in ways far harder to contain than a cruise missile storage bunker on an uninhabited island. At the exact same time, Iran's actual chain of command looks less like a unified government capable of making a single binding decision to step back from that deadline, and more like a set of institutions moving independently of each other. A diplomatic arm that keeps insisting on restraint it cannot actually enforce, and a military arm that keeps taking actions that make restraint impossible. A one-week ultimatum aimed at a country's power grid only works as pressure if there is a single decision maker on the other end capable of receiving it and acting on it before the deadline arrives. Right now, it is not clear that decision maker exists in a form either side can actually negotiate with. There's also an Israeli dimension to this week that runs quietly underneath the American strike campaign without ever fully separating from it. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to travel to Washington in the coming days, specifically to meet with Trump. A visit that regional reporting has tied directly to coordinating next steps against Iran, now that the ceasefire has broken down for a second time. Israel was a co-equal partner in the operation that killed Khamenei back in February, and nothing in the reporting since suggests that partnership has weakened, even as American Central Command has taken the lead on the day-to-day strike campaign around the Strait of Hormuz specifically. A joint escalation ladder involving both Washington and Jerusalem gives Iran even less room to maneuver than an American campaign running alone would, because any response Tehran mounts against Israeli territory reopens an entirely separate front on top of everything already happening in the Gulf. The Revolutionary Guard's own public threats this week point toward exactly that kind of widening. Beyond the warning about shutting down every export corridor it says benefits the United States, Iranian state media reported air defenses being activated around the Bushehr nuclear power plant in the country's south this week, with no official comment on what triggered that activation. Whether that was a genuine incoming threat, a defensive exercise, or simply Iranian state media managing the narrative around civilian anxiety near the country's most sensitive nuclear site, it is impossible to say with confidence from the outside, and that uncertainty is itself worth naming rather than glossing over. What is not in question is that Iran continues exporting petroleum products in enormous volume despite everything happening around it, with one regional outlet reporting the country moved roughly $6 billion worth of petroleum products in just 26 days, even as the blockade and sanctions campaign intensified. That figure alone tells you the blockade, for all its symbolic and strategic weight, has not actually managed to fully choke off Iran's ability to move oil. which is exactly why Washington keeps reaching for additional levers: the Treasury sanctions, the infrastructure ultimatum, the possibility of seizing Karg Island outright rather than treating the blockade on its own as sufficient. All of which is to say, the honest strategic picture heading into the next 72 hours is not a simple binary between war and peace. It is a countdown clock sitting on top of at least 4 active fronts at once: the nightly strike campaign in the Gulf, the financial squeeze running through Treasury and the reimposed blockade, a widening proxy front with the Houthis testing Saudi patience in Yemen, and a possible Israeli-American coordination meeting in Washington that could reshape the entire campaign before that one-week deadline on the power grid even arrives. Any one of those fronts moving the wrong way in the next few days could make the infrastructure ultimatum irrelevant by overtaking it entirely. Let's go back to where this started, because none of the tension from those explosions on Greater Tunb Island this morning has resolved into anything close to an ending. The strikes are still running, night after night, exactly as promised. The blockade is still standing. The tankers still burning in Omani waters this week are still burning. And somewhere between a battlefield ultimatum given on live television and a country whose actual chain of command nobody outside Tehran can fully map anymore, a one-week clock is now running toward a decision about whether an entire nation's power grid becomes the next target in a war that keeps finding new ways to prove it is not close to ending.